we should be protecting and restoring ecosystems. Of course we should fund Indigenous communities to manage their country. But the idea that the cost is that we infinitely store geological carbon in trees and soil, it's not just unscientific, it is nonsense.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and you may have heard that the federal government's safeguard mechanism has been introduced to the Parliament for debate. It's the main climate policy to reduce emissions from Australia's biggest polluters. But the safeguards mechanism has some serious flaws, including allowing polluters to buy unlimited carbon offsets instead of genuinely decarbonising their businesses. And as ABC's Four Corners program, Carbon Colonialism, showed, there are serious concerns about the integrity of carbon offsets both internationally and domestically.
Preserving these rainforests is vital to the planet. We're told the way to do that is to turn the carbon in the trees into an asset to be sold as carbon credits.
A rainforest protection project Australian companies are using to offset their greenhouse gas emissions is under attack from logging. Australian law firms and super funds, the environment group Planet Ark, the Sydney Opera House and Nespresso have all bought carbon credits from the venture.
At the heart of Labor's climate change policy, revamping the safeguard mechanism.
The government wants to strengthen the safeguard mechanism, a tool to cap and reduce emissions from the country's heaviest polluting companies.
Safeguards mechanism reform that we're putting forward is a big deal. It will require 205 million tonnes of emissions to come out of the system by 2030.
It's very complex area of policy, obviously, dealing with 215 of the heaviest emitters.
This is a massive, complicated beast, the safeguard mechanism.
Would allow companies covered by the scheme to trade emissions among them. The coalition is opposed, so the government will need the Greens to get its bill through Parliament.
Greens say they'll only back it if Labor bans new gas and coal projects.
Stop making the problem worse. Stop opening new coal and gas projects.
The biggest concern is that the government is opening the door to our biggest emitters paying to pollute rather than becoming more efficient and decarbonising.
The Australia Institute held the Climate Integrity Summit at Parliament House here in Canberra on the 15th of February 2023, where we brought together leading experts, key parliamentarians and journalists to discuss the integrity risks that could jeopardise Australians' emissions reduction policies, such as fraudulent net zero claims, over-reliance on carbon offsets, greenwashing and more that really serve the fossil fuel industry far more than the climate. One of these leading experts was our very own Climate and Energy Program Director, Polly Hemming. An expert in carbon and environmental markets, climate integrity and greenwashing, Polly gave a speech at the summit titled, "What is Climate Integrity?"
Thanks, Ebony. To understand and define what climate integrity is, it's important to have a good common understanding of what climate integrity isn't. In the government's first annual climate change statement to Parliament last year, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, said, after listing the devastating physical impacts of climate change, that to not do anything would be an unforgivable act of intergenerational negligence. On the same day, the government released its annual emissions projections, which showed that fugitive emissions, the emissions from extracting gas and coal, will increase between now and 2030. Increase during the so-called critical decade. This is not climate integrity. Just months after winning the election on an ambitious climate platform and then enshrining a more ambitious climate target in law, the Australian government committed $1.9 billion to a gas processing facility in the Northern Territory. This is the same amount that is dedicated to an entire fund designed to decarbonise our regions. This is not climate integrity. The government's safeguard mechanism, notionally designed to tackle Australia's ballooning emissions from mining and industry, does nothing to stop new gas and coal projects from going ahead. It allows the fossil fuel industry to increase its emissions as long as it buys some offsets. Think about that. This is Australia's #1 climate policy, and it does nothing to stop fossil fuel emissions. In fact, it protects and legitimises the #1 thing that is causing climate change, fossil fuel expansion. This is not climate integrity. Australia's policies have been, and still are, characterised by conflicts of interest, regulatory capture, creative accounting, and expanding gas and coal production. Under the previous government, there were 114 new gas and coal projects in development, the emissions from which would result in about 1.7 billion tonnes of CO2 every single year. That's twice as much as global aviation, which has actually jumped now to 117 in projects. Yes, this government did inherit a decade of delay, but it is because of that decade of delay that we look to them now with such hope and desperation. Yet at a time when we can, and we should be doing everything, literally everything in our power to cut emissions and use our wealth and creativity to help our neighbours, the Australian government actually isn't providing regulation or incentives that will result in absolute emissions reduction that the science says we so desperately need. It appears to be greenwashing its ambitious climate rhetoric by supplying millions and millions and millions of carbon offsets that fossil fuel companies can use to say that they're net zero. As Bill said, relying on offsets from the land sector instead of actually decarbonising our economy is a problem in and of itself. But it's made even worse by the fact that most of these offsets are junk. The government knows this, which is why it commissioned a review of Australia's carbon credits, a rushed review, more of a box-ticking exercise than anything else. The review panel ignored advice from industry itself saying that it was getting too many carbon credits. It did not examine a single piece of satellite data, satellite imagery or project data before it came to the conclusion that there were no problems with Australia's carbon offsets. In the meantime, Minister Bowen himself was encouraging participation in the carbon market, and the government, while the review was taking place, was drafting legislation that explicitly assumed that the review would give Australia's carbon offsets the all clear. Australia is on the precipice of something that could be magnificent. There is cause for optimism. We finally have the opportunity to change the course of the last 10 years. We do have a new climate target enshrined in law. We do have new funds and programs that could be used for public investment or to drive private investment in genuine decarbonisation across our economy. The community appetite, of course, for action is greater than ever before. In his address to Parliament, Minister Bowen said on behalf of the government, "How we've begun is how we intend to continue." I sincerely hope that that is not the case, because rather than take the leap away from the past and towards the ambitious transformation that's needed, it seems like the government has begun paralysed by fear of the fossil fuel industry, just like the government before it. This is not climate integrity. Integrity requires courage. The risk is that to avoid the political costs that come with genuine decarbonisation, the government intends to continue using the policy architecture set up by the previous government, the safeguard mechanism, our offset scheme and creative accounting. I agree with Minister Bowen. Unless something changes dramatically, this is an unforgivable act of intergenerational negligence. Closer to home, it's also a betrayal of the people who voted for climate action in 2022. Climate integrity is the antidote to Australia's state-sponsored greenwash. Climate integrity is not confined to government, although that's where it starts. Climate integrity is the lens through which we must view climate claims, whether they're made by government or industry. Currently, in the absence of regulation, clear reporting frameworks and adequate consumer laws, the onus has been placed on us, as citizens, consumers, voters, journalists, academics, to spot the greenwashing by business and government. Australia's biggest polluters have net zero targets, while telling their shareholders that fossil fuel production is increasing. We've been given the exhausting and impossible task of deciphering whether claims made by industry, banks and governments are actually consistent with their actions. This shift in responsibility is no accident, it's a strategy. In Australia and elsewhere, greenwashing serves the interests of both the private sector and government. Big emitters make net zero pledges to prolong the viability of their existing business models. Similarly, when impossible claims like being a net zero gas company or selling carbon neutral petrol are made, the government sees an opportunity to delay a conversation about phasing out internal combustion engines or stopping fossil fuel exports. And these are real examples. The Australian government has its own carbon neutral certification scheme, Climate Active, that endorses and celebrates these claims. Fossil fuel companies and retailers, AGL, Energy Australia, Ampol, Origin Energy and Telstra, which is now an energy retailer, are all celebrated as carbon neutral and literally described as progressive climate leaders. This is not climate integrity. Polling by the Australia Institute shows that the overwhelming majority of us have heard the term carbon neutral, but just 30% actually know what it means, or say they actually know what it means. Over 30% of Australians, according to our polling, say that coal-fired electricity that has been offset has the same climate impact as 100% renewable energy, and that there would be less need for electric vehicles if all petrol was certified carbon neutral. These figures show that it is unreasonable to expect consumers and voters to know whether a carbon neutral claim is legitimate. It's also impossible for businesses acting in good faith to know whether they're actually doing the right thing. It should not be up to any of us to put out the constant spot fires of greenwash. Climate integrity puts the onus back on government and industry to prove that their climate claims are legitimate. Whether you are government or business, until you can prove to have climate integrity, sadly, we have to assume that you don't. There have been too many fraudulent claims for us to be able to trust what we're told. Principles of climate integrity are simple. There's no hierarchy to these principles, but the one I'll start with is simplicity itself. My son's 6 years old. He knows that the two fundamental things that need to happen to address climate change are to stop burning fossil fuels and to stop breaking habitat, which I interpret as stop land clearing. My kids are interested in climate change, but I don't evangelise at them. They inherently know that to credibly address climate change, these things need to happen first and foremost because it is obvious. If I ask my son how to save trees, his response would not be, "Mum, what about creating a complex market-based mechanism based on a dubious and unprovable counterfactual?" His response would be, "Mum, if you want to save trees, don't let people cut down trees." In Australia, we've been led to believe that climate policy must be complex. In fact, there's evidence that the human brain is geared for complexity bias. We actively prefer complicated solutions and explanations over simple ones, whether we understand them or not. In Australia, so much is hidden in complexity. A key feature of the government's safeguard mechanism is that it is incredibly technocratic and complicated. We assume that if we don't understand it, then it must be important. This is a design feature, it's not an accident. I'm not saying that good climate policy is easy. It's not, but it is simple. We need to stop doing the harmful things, and we need to invest in the good things. The second principle of climate integrity, it must be science-based. I shouldn't even need to say it. The conclusions of climate scientists like Bill Hare are unambiguous. The world needs to rapidly reduce the amount of actual greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. I cannot believe I'm standing here in 2023 saying this. I cannot be any clearer. A climate policy that allows fossil fuel expansion is not based on science. The argument that climate policy must be pragmatic, of course, it has some merit, but it's an argument that has been weaponised to justify delay. The science calls for absolute reductions. It does not call for creative baselines, for a reduction in emissions intensity per tonne of coal produced, of taking some reductions from a column in a spreadsheet and using them to offset the increases in another. Carbon offsets may have a small role to play in Australia's climate policy, but it must be acknowledged that it comes at the expense of genuine decarbonisation. And when they're used in bad faith, offsets always result in an increase in emissions. The majority of Australia's carbon offsets come from the land sector. Of course, we should be helping farmers store more carbon in their soil. Of course, we should be protecting and restoring ecosystems. Of course, we should fund Indigenous communities to manage their country. But the idea that the cost is that we infinitely store geological carbon in trees and soil, it's not just unscientific, it is nonsense. Which leads me to the third principle, independence. It's not enough to be science-based. The science must be independent and used with integrity. Climate policy in Australia has been subverted, so industry sets the climate standards it wants from government, not the other way around. Science is manipulated and distorted by industry interests and then regurgitated on the websites of government agencies. This is evident in the activity of the Australian government's Clean Energy Regulator, the nominally independent agency developing and overseeing Australia's carbon offsets. It also happens to be a paying member of Australia's carbon offset industry lobby group. The CER consults with the fossil fuel industry and major carbon developers when developing the scientific methods that generate carbon offsets, though these lines are blurred as well, as Australia's largest carbon offset developers and aggregators all now have links to the fossil fuel and resources sector. Clean Energy Regulator has also been shown to try and influence and suppress, showing the manifest flaws in Australia's carbon offset scheme. None of this fits the legal definition of corruption, but the processes have been corrupted. Australia's carbon offset scheme is not underpinned by independent science. Of course, if we were allowed to see the data for ourselves, we could see whether our policies truly were based in science or not, and whether that science had been used with integrity, which brings me to the next principle of climate integrity: transparency. Government and industry have refused to release the data that would show unequivocally what is happening on every one of Australia's carbon offset projects. The government doesn't even release national satellite data of Australia's deforestation. Claims of commercial incompetence and cabinet incompetence are the government's defence against independent scrutiny. At an industry level, currently there is no overarching government framework that requires the industry to disclose its greenhouse gas emissions comprehensively and transparency, which allows the authors of corporate sustainability reports to cherry-pick the data they reveal, again putting the onus on us to decipher it. There is a direct relationship between transparency and corruption. The Robodebt inquiry has made it clear that public servants routinely conceal critical information, as does industry. A whistleblower last year revealed that the coal industry has been making fraudulent claims about coal quality for years. Climate integrity is having nothing to hide, at any level. Of course, it's reasonable to expect that industry will always game the system. This isn't a criticism, it's the nature of the beast according to economic theory. Milton Friedman, the free market advocate, said it best: the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. This means that even those companies acting in good faith are likely to only do the bare minimum required of them. For this reason, the next principle is that climate integrity, climate policy, must be driven by government. Nicholas Stern told us, climate change is the biggest case of market failure in history. Markets cannot solve market failure. It is the role of government to set boundaries and provide incentives, and it is the role of the private sector to respond. Ultimately, it is the ambition of government that will determine the ambition of industry, which leads me to the sixth and final principle of climate integrity. Climate policy must be conservative. If we're to tackle climate change, we need to be honest with ourselves and with each other about the size of the task, but also our willingness to act on it. The climate claims of government and industry are overinflated at best and manifestly false at worst. Woodside says our natural gas can help reduce global emissions. Telstra says it's passionate about tackling climate change now and in the future. Minister Bowen has said our government has hit the ground running with a strong agenda of climate action. But Australia's fossil fuel emissions are still rising, and there are 117 new gas and coal projects in the pipeline. A lack of humility not only undermines trust, it's actually dangerous. Climate policy must be conservative, it must be risk-averse. We don't get a second chance with this. The Australian government confidently reports on the emissions from open-cut coal mines without really knowing how much fugitive methane is being released. It boasts that Australia has so many trees that we can comfortably keep emitting in other sectors of the economy. Every tonne of greenhouse gas counts. All it will take is another black summer or the realisation that someone has got an equation wrong for our emissions accounts to look vastly different. Philosophically, when we think of integrity, we think of it as having honour or moral purpose. When we apply the term to concepts or objects, integrity refers to being uncontaminated or structurally intact or pure. Climate integrity, at its core, incorporates both these interpretations. Minister Bowen said in his address to Parliament, we have to be a good international citizen. But going beyond the moral imperative, our policy must also be robust, grounded in truth, and uncorrupted in all senses of the word. Moving forward, Australia must have humility. We must acknowledge our slow progress on climate. We must release the grip industry has on our democracy and hold corporate interests to account. And of course, we must stop approving new gas and coal mines. Everything will flow from there. This is climate integrity. Thank you.
Polly's speech was recorded live on Wednesday the 15th of February 2023 in Parliament House, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a double N double T. Polly is at Polly J Hemming. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.